Well, thank you all for coming. I wanted to talk today about something I consider extremely important for our directorate. Today's talk is exclusively about inclusion and diversity. And this is an issue that I think is important from our business perspective and from a personal perspective as well. So let me start by talking a little bit about some of my own experience and how that informs my own views on inclusion and diversity for Brookhaven. And for those of you who don't know, I actually spent the first 20 years of my career at IBM Research in Yorktown Heights. And I learned a lesson very early on in my time at Yorktown. I came there as a postdoc, and I was hoping to become a research staff member, a permanent member of the staff. And so I was given a very challenging project, and I learned very early on how teams are extremely important. And in particular, there was a fantastic technician at IBM, Paul Rowland, who, without his help, I would not have been successful. I had the idea, I knew what science I wanted to do. He was an expert at designing a fairly complicated machine that would do the experiment that I needed to do. And without Paul's help, I wouldn't have had my career start be quite successful. And so I learned early on that the ability to work well with colleagues, very different backgrounds, was extremely important. And I'd like to give another example about how giving people their opportunity to do better is important. And this is, I'll give one reflection from my time here at Brookhaven. There's a person in our directorate who joined Brookhaven straight out of high school, like a lot of folks do. And she spent a good number of years working as an administrative assistant. But she wanted to reinvent herself, and she trained herself in proposal support. There's this whole process called the Shipley process. For those of you who don't know what Shipley is, it's this firm outside of Washington that is very good at writing proposals for federal contracts. And they develop a system for proposal capture, support, and management that is quite famous, and they market that now. And it's called the Shipley process. And this person that I'm thinking of decided that she wanted to do this. And she trained herself. She went down to Shipley. She asked for support to go down there and get trained. And she has become a consummate professional in helping us write better proposals. And I could point to several major wins that we've had that frankly wouldn't have happened without her enormous support in managing that whole process. And so it's very important, I think, to give people an opportunity to do the best they can do, to speak up, to say, hey, I want to learn new skills, and to improve our competitive position. And then finally, another bit of background on what has helped shape my opinion about inclusion and diversity. For those of you who don't know, I also teach at Stony Brook, and I taught Physics 311 with Emilio Mendez last semester. We shared the teaching duty. And it became very apparent that the workforce of the future is very different. And at Stony Brook, they give the faculty a photograph of everybody in the class, a class roster, so you can call on people if you're having class discussions. And this is what I got. This is Physics 311, and this is an interesting photo. This is the future workforce that we're going to be trying to get at Brookhaven. Of the 14 students we had, 11 were female, and as you can see, several are from underrepresented minorities. So it started me thinking, these are the people that we want to attract to Brookhaven. We want them to want to work here. And to do that, I think we have some work to do. And we want to make sure we're creating an environment that is more inclusive. And if we have a more inclusive environment, we'll have a more diverse workforce. And that's what today's talk is all about. And that's the sole reason for today's talk, because I think it's extremely important. So I want to start with thinking about bias. And we all have biases, implicit biases. And in fact, there's a link down here. By the way, this talk we're going to post on our webpage. There's a link down here for Project Implicit. It's something that is at Harvard, and it's a way that you can go and you could take a test. You could test yourself to see if you have any implicit biases. Well, I have biases. You do this test and you find that you do have implicit biases. The point is not that I'm going to eliminate any biases that I grew up with or that are implicit. The challenge is to understand that we have those and to work to overcome them, to transcend those biases. And that's an important recognition that we have implicit biases and that we have to do things to take that out of the equation. It absolutely affects our workforce. And there's some cartoons here and a couple of examples. These biases that we're not even conscious of, they're reflected sometimes in our actions, and we sometimes create a non-inclusive environment. And, some of the examples. Assuming that a woman coming into a hospital room is a nurse instead of a doctor because of her gender. And there are a couple of things here. If somebody's on the board doing some mathematics, wow, gets it wrong, you suck at math. But if it's a female, wow, girls suck at math. These are examples of implicit biases. And this one over here, this is a cartoon of something that I think many of us have heard about. There was a study done where they took identical resumes and sent them out in the science. Well, we have to improve the quality of our double-stick tape, I think. That's the next all hands. But they took identical resumes and they just changed the gender. In fact, the cartoon, one says Joe Blow, the other one says Joanne Blow. And this was in Science, and they sent them out to a bunch of scientists. Both male and female preferred the male candidate. Identical resumes. Again, we have implicit biases. Actually, the best thing I've heard is hiring in orchestras has changed tremendously when they started doing auditions behind a curtain. So you couldn't see who was playing. And all of a sudden, it changed the hiring practices and the diversity of the orchestra. So there are a number of things that, because we have implicit biases, they can affect our workforce. And we want to create that inclusive environment so that we can attract that workforce of the future and keep Brookhaven strong. We have to be competitive. As you all know, we're in an extremely competitive environment these days, and we have to do our best. And inclusion, this is a very important point, inclusion is very important to us being competitive. The teams that are collaborative do better. They're just so much better when you have a good environment within a team so that people are encouraged and supported in collaborating. And I think it's extremely important that all voices are heard, because the best ideas, and I've certainly seen this myself, the best ideas are not necessarily the loudest voices. And the best ideas sometimes are in somebody that is reticent and a little afraid to speak up. There might be a fear of retaliation or a fear of mocking. So we have to create, I think, an inclusive environment. And it's also shown that diverse backgrounds bring different views, and you get solutions. There are lots of studies on this. You get solutions that are more creative, and you get them faster when you have a diverse work team. So the future expects a diverse workforce, and we need it to be competitive. By the way, because of the projector, I wanted to mention something at the beginning. I forgot, so I'll do it now. These slides were prepared by myself working with a group of folks that have been working for a long time. And I want to point out that we've been doing a lot of research. We've been looking at what's out there. And people have been spending a lot of time. Actually, over a year, we've been looking at the best practices out there. And we've got a group, and I'll talk about them in a few minutes, that has done a tremendous job, and I thank them, and I'll thank them again. But I wanted to point out that we've been doing a lot of research. We've been looking at what's out there. We've been looking at the studies. We've been looking at the best practices, and that's what led to this talk. Now, in the last year, since we started this, there have been a lot of headlines. This is a very timely topic in many ways because of the headlines. I won't go through this. Again, this talk is going to be on our webpage, but I think you all know, if you've been reading a newspaper in the last year, the problem is real. So, how are we doing? What are we doing in the directorate? Well, actually, in some ways, by some measures of diversity, we're doing great. This is a map of the world, and it shows where people who are in our directorate come from. So the dark gray stuff here, those are places where we get people. And we're doing great. We have representation from around the globe. And so we have a very diverse community in our directorate already in terms of where people come from. And that, I think, is part of why this is an interesting place. But we're not doing so well in terms of diversity, particularly with regard to women and underrepresented minorities. And this comes out in statistics, and I don't want everybody to try to do the eye chart here and read. I just want to make a few points. We've been looking at how we're doing as a directorate. We've been making measures. And so what I've got circled here are just the postdocs in the various departments and divisions of our directorate. And how does that compare to what's in the available workforce? So on the right is the workforce. That's what's available in condensed matter physics, materials, chemistry. And then over here is how we're doing. And the fact of the matter is our hires are not necessarily reflecting the available pool. And so that tells me that we're not creating the right environment where we're making it a place where people want to come to work. And we have to do that. We have to do that if we're going to be successful. That was, this previous was on women, and also we have demographics on underrepresented minorities as well. And the bottom line is we need to do better. I just want to make one other point before I go on. These statistical studies that we talk about, they don't always show the whole picture. And, you know, gender and race, those are things we could see. But there are a lot of traits that we can't see. And if we're going to make for example, religion, and we want to make sure that we're creating an environment that is an inclusive environment, even for the things that you can't see. We want people to feel comfortable here if we're going to want them to work. So what are models? Like I said, we've been doing a lot of work. We've been out there looking at what's going on in the world. And there's a very successful model, and I had experienced this. I'd seen this because I came from IBM. And it's a pretty darn good model. And I would argue that IBM has been a pretty successful technology company. They recognized early on the need to be inclusive and to have a diverse workforce. And one of the remarkable things, IBM had hired its first underrepresented minorities, first black IBM employees, and their first female. in 1899. It goes back a long ways. 1935, Thomas J. Watson Sr. promised equal pay for equal work. And today, IBM is led by a woman. And it's a very successful company, and they have to attract a diverse workforce if they're going to remain a technology leader. And this is a very challenging area. So what do? How are they so successful? And there are three pillars that IBM is using. One is attraction. They do a lot to reach out, to develop that STEM pipeline. They even go beyond college. They go down to the junior high school level. Corporate responsibility. What that means is it comes from the top. It's something that is supported by the CEO and CEOs before the current CEO. It's something that goes back to Thomas J. Watson Sr. They advance people. And this is important. Not only skill development and making sure that, there's succession planning. What does sponsorship mean? Well, we hear a lot about mentoring. I look at sponsorship as a more active form of mentoring. Mentoring is a little bit passive. You talk to somebody, you give them advice. But active mentoring or sponsorship is when the IBM has people that are connected with various promising folks, and they actively try to, hey, you ought to consider this person for that job. I think they'd be great. And so they work hard to advance people. And then retention, innovative practices, flexible work schedules. It's aimed at giving support. So then our group that has been looking at this, what works and what doesn't work in diversity programs. It's important. We're trying to set something up. We have a goal of making a more inclusive workforce, of improving our diversity statistics. So what works? So we've been looking at this. Well, again, there are a lot of studies. There's a reference here to one of these studies. But diverse task force, diversity managers, mentoring, and I'll take that to sponsorship at some point. These are, having looked at that, this helped us, looking at the models, looking at what works, this helped us to form our plan. And let me just say a few more words about what's out there. Here's another interesting study, and it looks at the treatment of women and how it depends on what race they come from. And I'll just pick one over here. Women that have been mistaken for administrative or custodial staff, well, if you're black or Latina, it's much more likely to happen. And so we have to this is again, there are implicit biases. We can't let ourselves be driven by these stereotypes. In the cartoon, if you can't read the caption, it's Dr. Williams, thank you. So who's been doing some things? I'm going to give you 2 slides on examples. You can close, at least in the gender, you can close those gaps where you create a culture where they feel they belong. And there's a good example here from Harvey Mudd College. Computer science has been mandatory for a long time at Harvey Mudd. But yet, only 10% of their graduating class was female, up until very recently. So the computer science department said, we've got to change things. And what did they do? Well, there were 3 things. They promoted the image of women in computer science. Image is very important. Showing female majors have relatable role models, somebody you could look at and said, that could be me. And training the faculty to avoid stereotyping. When they did that, the graduation rate now has 50%, representing the population of of Harvey Mudd. It's a success story. It's also well recognized in the business world. And I've got a whole bunch of quotes here, but I'll just point to a couple. One from a company called Elevist. And I like this. They talk about culture add over culture fit. And they think that it's important to have that diversity of viewpoint, the diverse backgrounds, to keep them on the leading edge. And I kind of like that quote, culture add over culture fit. And from YouTube, diversity is important so you prevent homogeneity and losing your competitive edge. As I mentioned earlier, there are lots of studies that have shown when you have diverse teams, you get better solutions and you get them faster. And this is reflected in what CEOs are saying. So I wanted to talk about micro inequities and how that is hurting us. This is essentially, how in any science or technology organization, we can actually impair performance. And some of them are, completely unconscious, and I've done some of these myself, using he when discussing a position or a potential candidate. We often do that. I've done it in the past. And that impairs the culture, frankly. Mispronouncing somebody's name. Confusing people of color in the workplace with each other. I've seen that happen here. Ignoring an idea when expressed by one employee, but acknowledging it when paraphrased by another. Actually, the New Yorker cartoon that I didn't read the caption on earlier, that was exactly what that was about. These are micro inequities, and they create a culture that is non-inclusive. So, what are we going to do? I said that we need to remain competitive. We're in a highly competitive situation. We're all working on proposals, and I thank folks for doing that. And the teamwork has been terrific here, but we need to do better. So to achieve our vision of securing Brookhaven for the long term and keeping us competitive and attracting the next generation, the first thing is we've established an Inclusion and Diversity Council. And that's within our directorate. The laboratory is also doing things. But I believe strongly that we have to do things locally, and we have to embrace this locally. So we've established an Inclusion and Diversity Council. The next couple of slides, I'll say a little bit more about that. Recruitment and hiring is extremely important. So we're going to talk about some changes we're making there. Communication. If we're going to create a supportive environment, we have to make sure people are not afraid to speak up. We have to be strong enough to be able to listen and to take those comments and embrace them, but we also have to make it so that people are not afraid to say something. And one of the things that I found personally very disturbing was that this is a real problem. There have been people in our directorate who've been afraid to say something. And establishing goals. I've established lots of goals for myself, and I'm going to talk about how we're going to establish our goals for inclusion and diversity. So the first part is this council. I wanted to say a few words about that. And we wrote a charter for this a year ago, and we've updated it a lot, actually. And so I'm just going to actually read words because I want to get this one right. The mission statement is, create a welcoming and empowering work environment that allows all members of the staff to participate in the directions and decisions within the directorate, independent of diversity traits, gender, race, sexual orientation, age, cultural background. We need everybody to be an integral part of our culture. I don't want those best ideas to be left unsaid. If we're going to be competitive, we have to create an environment where people can can contribute ideas. The role of this council is to advise me and help implement. and I'll talk about what we're doing. And this is the membership, and I particularly want to thank Diane Cabelli and Vivian Stoyanov. They were really a big part of the inspiration. They had the courage to come up and talk to me a year ago and bring this to my attention, and I'm greatly indebted to them. And we have people from around the directorate that are members of this: Michael Cowell, Ken Evans-Luderoth, Mike Bebon, Grace Webster, John Tranquata, and Stacia Skoka. These are folks that represent a broad part of our directorate. Every division is there except one, and I'm going to work to get that division represented also. So I mentioned we have a charter. Again, something transparency. We're going to post that on our webpage. And what are we trying to do? Facilitate the recruitment, advancement, and retention, the IBM model, of a diverse workforce. Create and enable better communication practices where all voices are heard. They're advising me on best practices, and this council has done an enormous amount of hard work doing the research, looking at what's out there, and getting those best practices, figuring out what's going to work for us, because we're kind of a unique environment in many ways. We're not like industry, we're not like academia, and so what works best here? And then to assist me in the development of the workplace and implementation, frankly. So the first thing we looked at was the hiring process. Is this serving our goals? And what do I mean by the hiring process? Well, we've got to recruit people. We've got to see who's qualified, decide who gets interviewed, do the interview, make an offer, and then bring them on board, hiring. In looking at this, and we actually had, thanks to HR had been collecting a lot of great data for us over the last 2 years almost. We were able to look at a lot of data, and our hiring practice needs tuning. Our candidate pool lacks diversity, and the diversity decreases as you go through the process. In other words, and this is an important thing, if you put a little bit of a barrier in all these steps, it adds up to a huge barrier at the end. And that's kind of been happening to us. So I'm going to go through some numbers and show you a little data. And we're using, in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see an Eric Johnson patented bullseye chart. And what this shows is what happens. So the outer ring of this represents the applications, then the number of qualified. That circle represents the qualified. That ring is the qualified. This ring, the interviewed, and then in the middle, the hiring. And so let's look at that. And then the different colors represent, in this case, women, men, and the green are undeclared. So is it serving our goals? And so we looked at, like I said, we looked at data from FY16 through FY17 for 21 months. We had a lot of data. There are over 2,900 people who applied for positions in that period. On the top are the scientist levels. On the bottom are managers, professionals, and RAs. And you see kind of the same thing in both. I'll point to this one since it's down near me. This is what happens. These are the number of applicants. Okay? And that fraction was the female. That was undeclared. When we get to the qualified, it got smaller. The interviewed got smaller. And when it got to hiring, the statistics here do not represent the pool that was out there originally. Same thing on the scientific level. What about underrepresented minorities? If I did a bullseye chart like that, you wouldn't see anything because it would be such a small slice. So here I'm just giving numbers. But you see the same sort of thing. And again, as you go from applicant to hired, and just look at the very first number, it's the African Americans, 2% of the applicants, 2% of the qualified, less than 1% of the interviewed, no blacks were hired at Brookhaven. Now, I didn't talk about admins and tech. There are only 10 in this period. Administrative staff is only women, and the tech staff is largely men. But I would say it's interesting, among the administrative staff, we actually have a good representation of underrepresented minorities. So that's one of the areas that was a bright spot. But we have to do so much better. So our hiring is limiting our ability to attract that diverse workforce. So again, what does the research show? If you have a job advertisement that has a subtle male bias, it discourages women from applying. And that limits our pool. So we have to make sure that we're writing appropriate job advertisements. That's really important. This is, again, research. This is stuff that we've looked at out there. Unstructured interviews are not good in predicting job success. However, structured interviews based on job-relevant criteria not only minimize bias, but you do a better job of getting a successful person into that position. Here's something that's really striking in the research. If the final candidate pool had only one minority candidate, very little chance, virtually no chance of being hired. However, if there are two, the odds go up dramatically by almost 200. So that's research. HR, our friends in HR have improved the lab hiring process to be more diversity-oriented. We're enhancing it by adding a few features. So we've revised the hiring process within our directorate. In general, let me state that there's a new HR subject area. We have interpreted that, which means we're saying what we are going to do to meet the requirements of that subject area. It starts with recruiting. I mentioned, that first bit in research, having poorly worded job descriptions. We want to make sure we have neutral wording, and we want to have realistic expectations based on the candidate pool. Frankly, a lot of and there's a document, by the way, we have you can't see it, but this is the front page of our hiring process within our directorate. One of the things that's critically important in this is planning. We have to do a much better job of planning throughout the whole process. The interview and evaluation, this is really important also. We want to make sure that people that are interviewing, we have a diverse panel. We want people to see that there are not just, a select group of gender and race that are doing all the interviews. We want to have more diverse. People need to see somebody that they can relate to. We're going to have standard questions designed to get to the job-relevant criteria. This thing about unstructured interviews is really important. We have to make sure that we design the questions to get the information we need to find out if that person is going to be successful. So we need more structure in our interview process. And we have to think about what answer we're looking for. So you've got a job. What do you really want? Figure out a question and try to determine what you're looking for. Then you can more fairly compare folks. And I think this is really important. After we make a hire, I want to have a sponsor to assist with assimilation. When I was hired 15 years ago, I came to the lab the first day and I was told, okay, go get trained for 3 days. We'll see you. We have to do a better job of welcoming people before they walk through that gate for their first day of work. And, one of my colleagues told about his experience in going into the Air Force. Well before this person went to his first assignment in Texas, somebody from that base called him up, gave them the landscape, introduced him to the commanding officer, made them feel welcome. We need to do more of that here. We don't just throw people into training. So we're going to pilot our new process. I'm just giving you a high-level view. We're going to pilot that now. I mentioned communication. There are a couple of aspects that I wanted to improve in giving people an opportunity to speak up. Suggestion boxes. The idea here is to just have I mean, we're talking wooden, old-fashioned paper and pencil. I think some people are reluctant to use electronic things, even with a guarantee of confidentiality. So we decided we're going to put up some plain old wooden suggestion boxes, and they're going to be collected by that council I talked about, and they're going to bring that to the attention of management. And here's something that I'm really excited about, and I think this is going to help. We are establishing something called the Peer Counselor Program. This is an informal avenue that provides a safe place for our staff to discuss concerns. This is before, the lab-wide employee support system has a formal complaint process, but, and people feel that it is very formal and it leads to an investigation and it could lead to discipline. And people might be afraid to say something, well, it's not that serious, it's not a complaint, it's a concern. And so we want to create this so that you've got somebody local to talk with. And so we're going to make this available. And these are our folks. They're available to talk about something with any staff member, something that's on their mind. These folks are members of my council, this Inclusion and Diversity Council. They're available to talk, listen, advise, and assist. And they may work to help resolve. A lot of times, somebody has a concern, and it could be resolved very locally. And I've seen that happen. And I want to make sure everybody knows that this is an avenue where they can get some local help. And I want them to be able to feel that they can express some concern that they have. I don't want people to be afraid. And there's a barrier to going to the formal process. Now, these are going to remain confidential to the extent possible. But however, everybody needs to know that if you go talk to one of these folks, if you bring a potential violation of law or B&L policy, then we're going to be obliged to take that to a higher level. If somebody's breaking the law, if somebody has hit somebody, for example, you can't just discuss that locally. That has to be taken higher. But for most things, I could see that it would remain local. So I just want to talk briefly about the principles that would guide the work of that program. These are intended to be neutral, informal, confidential, with the caveat, if there's imminent harm or violation of policy or something like that, then it has to be elevated. But other than that, it would be confidential and independent. These counselors, the Inclusion and Diversity Council, those folks just report to me. And it does not replace the laboratory's formal complaint process. So who are these folks? And again, I want to thank them very much, and we're going to have this on the website, and I do want to get photos. I wanted to have photos, but we didn't have everybody's photo. So Diane Cabelli and Vivian Stoyanov are the co-chairs of the Inclusion and Diversity Council, and again, I thank them very much. Other members include Michael Cowell, Ken Evans-Luteroth, Stacia Skoka, John Tranquata, and Grace Webster. And I want folks in our directorate to know that you can go to these people and use them as peer counselors. In addition, Diane has recently stepped down from some of her duties, and I've asked Diane Cabelli to be my special assistant on these I&D issues, inclusion and diversity, and she has agreed to do that, and so I thank Diane very much. It's a reflection, I think, of our directorate commitment. We need somebody who's going to be working on this to help keep things moving. There's a lot that we're trying to do, and so I thank the council very much. These folks have worked very hard, doing a lot of research, having a lot of discussions, and I greatly appreciate that. And these folks here who are volunteering to be peer counselors, I greatly appreciate that. So what do you do? All right, well, I'm asking everybody here to pick a goal. Set a goal for yourself on this. You choose your goal, obtain your supervisor's agreement, but I want it to be something that you're comfortable doing and something that you're passionate about, but it should be drived at changing our culture and improving our culture. Here are some ideas. Okay, everybody could have a different goal. You're setting your own. I highlighted two here just to give you an example. One is mentor a summer student from a underrepresented institution. Another is, and this is the top left there, look for behaviors in ourselves that's exclusionary and try to turn that around. Make it a more inclusive behavior. Management bears a bigger responsibility to become inclusive. And I bear a lot of responsibility for that. And I will confess that I've seen this. We make lots of mistakes because we're not inclusive in making decisions. And so we have to make sure that the relevant stakeholders are contributing. You know, one thing that has been pointed out to me on several occasions, we often overlook the administrative staff. They're the ones who have to implement a lot of these things, and if we don't get their input, we're foolish. And from the supervisory level up, we really have to figure out how we could become more inclusive in our decision-making process, including me. So I've set goals for myself. I picked more than one, but these are things that I'm doing to help change, to improve the culture. And I'm just going to point to the bottom one right now. There are great talks and events that are sponsored by BWIS. I'm going to do more to attend that and to promote that within our directorate. And in fact, for the last 2 years, I've gone to a BWIS-sponsored event over at Stony Brook that is fantastic. It's a Saturday. I think it's February. I know it's cold. These are really spectacular events where you can meet a lot of interesting folks, hear some illuminating discussions. Catherine Guarini from IBM was a speaker in the most recent one last February, or I forget exactly when it was. That was a terrific talk, and actually a couple of the slides I used actually came from Catherine. She is the vice president for strategy at IBM in Yorktown Heights. So the future of our directorate depends on if we're successful. We're in an extremely competitive era. It's getting more competitive. We have to get all the best ideas on the table and figure out what we're going to propose and how we're going to move forward. So our goal is to have everyone come to work feeling that they're empowered and respected. And I mentioned everyone here, and I meant that. And when I started off, I was looking at some of my reflections. They're admins, techs. It's not just the scientific staff. It's everybody here. And everybody is part of a team, and I gave a couple of examples. We need everybody to be successful here. And we need to listen to them. We all have to recognize that we do have our implicit biases, but we have to challenge those, understand them. It's very illuminating. Go to that Harvard link. Take the test. You'll be surprised. If we do that, if we're successful, I think we're going to have a more inclusive culture. And that could lead to the more diverse workplace. Even if we were able to be successful in hiring, unless we have an inclusive culture, we're not going to retain these folks. Why would they want to stay here if they don't feel welcome? Now, the tools that I talked about today, what we're doing, the hiring process, we made some changes there. I've asked everybody to do a goal, pick a goal. Communication with the peer counselors and suggestion boxes. This is what we're starting with. And by the way, this Inclusion and Diversity Council is not closed down. This is something that continues to meet. And we are continuously working, and we're going to be looking at what we do. So we're going to monitor, and we have to be honest. You know, that's why, frankly, when I looked at statistics, I thought we were doing better than we are. We're not. And so we have to be honest, and we have to reassess, and we have to figure out what's working and how to improve things. So it's hard, but I think the rewards are great. This is what I think is important to keep us competitive for the future. So that's the end of my slides. And I want to thank everybody for listening. Of course, I'll take questions. But before I do that, I'll just mention I'm going to have another talk in a short period where I'm going to talk about the budgets and what we're doing strategically. But I wanted to give this talk first because I think this is a foundational issue for our directorate. If we're going to remain competitive as we go forward, we have to have an inclusive environment here. We have to let all voices be heard. And I've seen that. You know, I've seen some amazing things come out of corners that ended up being great ideas for proposals, coming from some quiet folks. And there are teams that do a much better job than others of bringing out those ideas. We need to all do it. So with that, I'll stop and take some questions. Thank you very much. Ian.
The biggest problem seems to be the applicant pool. And that's the one you can do the least about, perhaps. But maybe there are some ideas how you can do something about it. I've had the same experience. My classes are with 50% women, no problem. But they go somewhere else. They don't apply here.
So Ian's comment, I'll just repeat it for others. The biggest problem is the applicant pool. How do we do something about that? Well, you're right. We don't have a good representation in that applicant pool. And part of that, I think, is the way we write job advertisements, the way we go out and search for these things. I think we have to do a better job in making more neutral job announcements so that people aren't intimidated to apply. But also, we have to be more active. I think we have to go out there and, you know, like I said, let's go to go to our alma maters and go out there and try to encourage that, to create that. But also, we do damage to ourselves, you know, if people have a bad experience at Brookhaven, that word can spread. And so this is why it's so important to make sure that I think the inclusion comes before diversity. And you know, just as a story, I originally called this group the Diversity and Inclusion Council, and I realized that you aren't going to have diversity unless you create an inclusive environment. So, you know, with the encouragement of the smarter people who are on this than I am, we call it the Inclusion and Diversity group. But I think this is one of the things we have to work on. That applicant pool has to be broader, and we have to do more to make that happen. That's right. That's how I ended up at IBM. An IBM recruiter came up to Cornell, and that's how I got there.
So, Jim, following that thread, who is the B&L recruiter at Berkeley? Who's going to MIT?
Right.
The answer is we don't have an organized system.
Exactly.
So I put it back to you at the directorate level. Can you please invest in this?
Yeah.
Concrete steps that can be taken here.
Yep.
It maybe has to start a little bit small as a pilot project. Fine, but let's get started.
So
We need to compete here effectively.
I couldn't agree more, Mark. So Mark's comment was, why don't we have those recruiters? Why aren't they out there at the university? So we have to start something, and we are. And in fact, we started with MIT, but we need to do more of that. And why don't you go back to Berkeley, Mark, and you know, visit your alma mater and talk, or Alex. I mean, we have people from these places that can get out there. I agree. We're going to have to. We're trying to do that.
So the follow-up point to that is it's not just getting people out there. It's having a system whereby the information that they gather is systematically used.
Yeah.
Right? So it wasn't just that there was
Right.
IBM understood how to share that information internally.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a series of steps really that are needed to make this fly.
It is. It's hard work.
But if we are out there, I submit we have a much better chance to compete for what we all know on at least the science track.
Yeah.
Is a restricted pool of young women in science, for example, who are graduating with PhDs.
Yeah. Yeah. And so yeah, you're right. There are other things that we've tried that haven't been quite so successful. We have gone to, there are associations of physicists and chemists for African Americans and Hispanics. We haven't been so successful, we've been there, but we haven't been so successful in making the connection. And I think part of the problem is we haven't done it quite systematically and provided the infrastructure that's necessary to turn that turn that initial contact into an interview. Yeah. I can't see who it is, but.
I'm Adrian from Minnesota too.
Hi.
So, a common complaint that underrepresented minorities have when they're first breaking into the workforce is that they have to work harder and longer than their white male counterparts in order to prove themselves. However, with the system that you have set up here with inclusion on the various committees, that the few people that we have of underrepresented minorities have to work harder and longer because of all the things they have to do.
Yeah.
So how do you plan on addressing that balance?
So the question is, and I'll paraphrase if I get it wrong, Adrian, you can correct me. People from either URM or a woman feels they have to work harder than their colleagues, and that research does support that. And yet I'm asking them to do double duty here. So how do we address that imbalance? I think we have to recognize, as a laboratory, the value of people working on this issue and make that a part of their reward in the performance appraisal system. And that's our whole way of doing this. If we do our performance appraisals properly, there shouldn't be that. You shouldn't have to work harder. You should be able to do, and the work that you do on things like the I&D Council should be recognized as a part of that.
So, following up on Mark's comment, it seems to me that if there was some sort of sponsored representation, go to professional society meetings, go to poster sessions, meet students, postdocs,
Yeah.
try to attract them at that level, that would be effective and also be, because if you go to a particular university, there are only so many people working on so many things. If you go to a society meeting, you have a wide discipline.
Yeah. So Jim's comment is not only go to universities, and in fact, maybe even better to go to professional society meetings, especially since we're recruiting in limited areas, and so that's a very good point. I think we have to do both, but in both cases, we have to support that effort though, and have the infrastructure in here to make sure that if you're going to a society meeting, you are bringing with you the jobs. You know what jobs are available that we're recruiting for, rather than just taking a shotgun approach at these things. And so that's, I think, some of the infrastructure that Mark was talking about. We have to be more organized, and we have to get to a place where we're doing a better job at that. But yeah, I think you're right, because where we're hiring is relatively narrow. So we have to, although I have to admit, I've seen people get hired and change directions in many cases and have been extremely successful. So, but you're right. Was there another question? Yes?
When I look at the overall diversity of our workforce, one of the biggest disparities I see is the age distribution. Those statistics you look at,
Yeah.
so as you get younger, you inherently get more diverse as far as race and
Yeah.
And you don't get local people because there's no local people that have that experience. So we get experienced people from other places who then don't stay here. Where I'd like to see us hire some more local, younger talent and actually train them. And then keep them.
Oh, yes. And so that's a really good point. And I have several comments, and it reminds me of something I forgot to say during the talk. One comment is that we do have an interesting age distribution here, and we are, a lot of our workforce is going to be retiring, and so that's a big motivation. And another point is that indeed, if we put in a requirement all this experience, it sometimes is too restrictive. And in fact, it often discourages people. Some people who don't quite have that experience would apply, and there are some studies that have shown that, for example, it will be more discouraging for people that we're trying to attract, some of the diversity candidates, because they're looking at, say, if I don't meet absolutely every requirement, I can't possibly hire. And so we do have to think about that, and that's why that job description is an important part of our revised hiring plan. But you brought up a very good point. We can do more with what I would call grow our own, bringing in local people and helping them out. And we've got a terrific example right now in the Sustainable Energy Technology department in our organization. I'm getting a little ring if I go on that side. We have a terrific example there where we've hired somebody, and this person is now completing a PhD, all while being a Brookhaven employee. And this is a really good example. This happens to be a woman, and it's a terrific example of how we can do more of that. So we have to look for those, and we have to, again, that happened because, frankly, Pat Looney and others have worked hard on this to make it happen. But I think to me, it's a glowing example of what we can do. We can grow our own. We can go out there and get people locally and show them, get them trained in what we need. Any others? Adrian?
What's the status of childcare?
Okay. It's where it was last time, and I think that's a problem for the lab, quite honestly. I'm hoping that if we build Discovery Park, that we'll have an avenue there. But the Child Care Center is not going to reopen, and I think that's a problem. I'm up here talking about diversity, and child care is one of the key things to create the right environment. It's a disappointment. Anything else?
So, Tim, a quick question.
Yeah, where is it?
The process, or kind of maybe we need to change our brand a little bit, get a more exciting brand. Maybe we're sort of branded as in a certain way that maybe it's not as exciting as Google or Amazon or Facebook.
Well, I take personal offense at that one. I think we're an incredibly exciting place. Yeah. 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 I think role models are very important. And being able to point out that, so I personally, as you'll see, I'm going to give another talk in a few weeks where I'm going to talk about the science and the budgets, which are looking much better this year, by the way. Thank you, Washington, for giving us the Nano Center in the budget. But I think it's a valuable point that I don't think we always have a public image about how exciting the place is. Although, man, if you come here on summer Sundays, the summer Sundays here are just amazing. I bring my daughters every year, and it's fun. It's exciting. We have to do more. Thanks, Ken. Yeah, Sean.
A lot of the discussion here has been about advertising better and getting people in. But I think the bigger issue, and it's why you put inclusion first, is we have to be better at inclusion when people actually get here. My own experience has been that it's really rather patchy.
Yeah.
And other staffs that send messages, but management especially sends messages which don't allow you the time to actually be inclusive. You know, and I think if it's going to be as big a part of what the future should be, I think all levels of the management, but I think especially the senior management, need to think about how do you create time for staff to be inclusive.
Yep.
And how do you echo that message through how they record at time.
So Sean brings up a point, if you didn't hear it, that, and I'll paraphrase Sean, but we have to work, especially at the management level, on supporting the transition to a more inclusive environment. And that's why I'm here. And it's not just the advertisement, and you started by talking about the advertisement. We're not going to change anything by changing the way we do advertisements. What we have to do is change our culture. Now, I hate that, I hate saying that in some ways, because that implies, I think we have in many ways a wonderful place here, but we have problems. We have to recognize those. That's what we're trying to do, and we have to give everybody an opportunity to change that, and that's why I want everybody to have a goal. I agree, I think management, and I had a slide on that, management has a bigger responsibility on this one. And so we're starting down this road, but we're going to have to keep an eye on this and make sure that some of these issues, everybody here, it's just amazing. I'm always astonished at how hard everybody is working here. How many jobs, some people are doing more than one job, are trying many, many things. The place is just amazing, and I want to ask everybody to add this to their job. I want you to add, everybody to take some steps to add inclusion. And that's why I want it to be something that is a goal that recognizes that, yes, I'm asking people to spend some time on this. Yeah.
Would there be a possibility to create something like a system for foreign nationals and people visas? When I was hired, and I was already in the country, so I was already living in the US for 2 years, but coming to a different country from people from abroad is really hard, and we have a lot of foreign nationals, and maybe it would be great to have someone from that home country or their native language help them along the way and offer that mentoring program. For example, if someone comes from France and we have a bunch of French scientists already, maybe one of them would offer themselves to help them out, how to get a car, how to get a social security number, how to get into the system, all these things that you need to learn if you come to the app.
Yeah.
So left alone with that. That's something that I would like to encourage.
I very much agree with you. And so the comment was, if you bring somebody in from, a foreign country, for example, you need to be especially helpful in getting them to assimilate to all the things that one has to do when you come here. And in fact, I mentioned it in our, let's see if I can find it very quickly in our slide. At the bottom here, I talked about a sponsor to assist with assimilation. We're going to need folks to help with that. I'm going to need to find those people from France that can call. And I am going to ask them to help. I think this is really important. And when I heard the story about, one of our colleagues that when they went into the Air Force and how he was helped to assimilate to that environment, it's things like that. This is where you go to find, the best housing on the campus. This is where you go to, get your driver's license. Just have somebody to help welcome rather than, go do your training. We have to do more. And so, yeah, we're going to be tapping folks to help with that. And this is one of those things that, again, I'm asking, we all have to contribute to this, but I think this assimilation is an important thing. Otherwise, they're going to, they could feel it's a very unfriendly, unwelcoming place. And that sends, and then they tell their colleagues. Thank you. All right, well, once again, I apologize for the small screen. We're going to post this, though, and I want to thank everybody very much.